So here we're looking at an article that was written by our Mosaic AI research team around the long context RAG performance of LLMs. The reason they wrote this article is that right now, as you know, we have more and more LLMs that have a longer context length. For example, Anthropic Cloud, 200,000 tokens context length, GPT-4 Turbo, Google Gemini. That means
Google
that
has 2 million context length.
Yes, that's like impressive, huge. Right?
Yeah.
And because of that, you can feed more and more documents, when you build a RAG app. But then there's a debate, apparently, around the fact that if you have LLMs that have really long context length, do you even need a RAG system? Because instead of putting a corpus into a vector search index, you could just feed that into your LLM completely and have the LLM give an output. And they talk a bit about like recent evaluations of long context models. And there's 2 limitations that they identified, that were in those evaluations. First is the lost in the middle problem. So that happens when models really struggle to retain and use information from the middle portions of long text. And then the second limitation is effective context length. So the amount of usable context length beyond which the model performance will start decreasing. And apparently it can be much shorter than the claimed maximum context length. And it's quite an important limitation to talk about because there's no point to get a 2 million, 2 million context length if it starts decreasing in performance after a while,
So for the first limitation for the missing middle part in the context, and that is why when we started doing a lot of RAG systems, we're trying to really tune the prompt so that we force, very clear introduction, very clear ask, and all the context goes in the middle. So, okay, if something is missing, it's not the ask to the LLM or the way I want to force the output to come to me. So it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And with these limitations in mind, they started to run over 2,000 experiments on 13 open source and commercial LLMs to uncover the performance. And the 3 findings were the following. So first, the fact that retrieving more information for a query will increase the likelihood that the right information is passed to the LLM. What does it mean? It means that the increased context size of those modern LLMs, those recent LLMs, it really has the potential to incorporate this extra information, which means that we will overall increase our RAG quality system. So
that makes sense, right? Because if the context is so long, then you can force all of this information into the context and you have better chances of finding the answer because it's not missed in the returned documents.
Exactly. But then we'll see, when we deep dive into this, that actually longer context is not always optimal for RAG. So we'll deep dive into this, but you can really see an increase of performance across all the models that evaluated from 2,000 to 4,000 tokens of context length. And sometimes it can continue increasing up to 16 to 32,000. But then most of the models, it starts decreasing after 32K or 64K. And you only have a handful of models that are able to maintain consistent long context RAG performance on the data sets that they evaluated on. So this is also a very interesting finding of their research.
Chunking of documents and understanding how the documents are structured is still applicable up to the optimal result we found here.
Exactly. The optimal choice will depend on the generation model, the task at hand, etc. But it means long context will not always mean this is optimal, basically. And finally, very interesting as well, although this is a bit sad because it depends. but it really depends on the model that you use, what kind of failure you're going to get. We can deep dive afterwards into their findings, but they tested like 13 LLMs, and every time they would fail in their own unique way. So some would reject, due to copyright concerns. Some would summarize the context. Some would give completely random or irrelevant answers. And it's quite interesting to see how each model behaves for long context length. So then, they start by just describing what RAG is, just a nutshell. You put some corpus of data into a vector index so that then you can retrieve relevant documents that you provide as context to an LLM. I think we have already done some videos on this. Feel free to check. And here we already discussed the limitations of long context models that they want to investigate. Here it's about the methodology. So they just show and share all the retrieval settings, the generation settings that they used for the experiments, the evaluation data sets. They used 4 of them, including the Databricks Docs QA, which is the only one that's not. I'm not sure this one is open source. And evaluation metrics, quite important. So for the retrieval metrics, they used recall. For the generation metrics, to evaluate how correct an answer was, they used LLM as a judge. Again, we discuss LLM as a judge in other videos, so feel free to check. And first experiment, how beneficial is it to retrieve more documents? So reminder, they chose recall in order to evaluate that. And here it's very interesting because for the NQ dataset, you get this saturation point from a context length of 8,000. But then for Databricks Doc QA and Finance Bench, it's from 96 and here 128, which is why they had the conclusion that, you can have that retrieving more documents can be beneficial because you're more likely to get, your relevant documents.
Yeah. So I'm curious to see what this NQ dataset is. Is it very well structured? So you need to pass less information into the document?
Natural questions. The queries are Google search queries. Yeah.
Anyway. Okay, interesting to deep dive into these datasets and understand their structure mainly.
Yes. Then the second experiment is about the long context on RAG. And you can see here already, here you cannot see it as much, but in all the other one, it's quite dramatic. The increased context length between 2 and 4 and how correct the answers are. In all of the experiment for the different data sets, you can always see a dramatic increase between 2 to 4, which is good to know for practitioners. And it continues to increase, until 16 to 32. But that's where you start having an inflection point where the correctness starts really decreasing.
Okay, so after that point, it seems that they kind of lose the information they need to focus on.
Exactly. Especially here, it's quite dramatic with this NQ data set. So something good to bear in mind. And if you want to deep dive, obviously they list all of the LLMs so you can see how their performance improves for each of those LLMs. So like we mentioned before, 2 to 4, consistent increase across everyone. Then you start having a saturation point for some of the models between 16 and 32K, and only the most recent models, like those ones, have improved long context behavior that shows no performance deterioration as context length increases. So something to be mindful of, when you build a RAG app. And finally, that's the one where they look at how LLMs fail and when. And so for this, they are categorizing, all the failures into types of failures. So for example, repeated content, random content, fail to follow instructions. So for example, where they say, hey, this is copyright concerns, blah, blah, blah. And here you can see how different it is from one LLM to another. So here we look at GPT-4. You can see with increased context length, you get more wrong answers. Whereas here for Claude, it's more fail to follow instructions.
Okay.
And when you look at here more open source models, you also have like wrong answers again, and different types of.
Mixtral is around 4K. 4K.
Yeah. And then here you have the one for DBRX. So I guess this is the added value is that first we know like that the failure categories really differ from one LLM to another. So I guess it's really good to be able to deep dive in this data to understand which one you would want to pick, depending on the task that you have, etc. And then deep dive even more into like the results and the correctness, etc. Did you mention that they suspect that such failures are caused by the lack of instruction following training data at longer context length for like to explain some of the failures? But yeah, very good, to diagnose errors.
So we're saying then that we should push more context to the LLM, but I understand up to 8Ks. Depending your model again, up to 8K is where you get the best out of it.
For certain LLMs,
for certain models, yeah.
Yes, only for certain ones. It was Claude 3 sonnets, copyright failures increases here, DBRX failure to follow instruction increases here, and they speculate that those particular ones, so for those particular models, is caused by the lack of instruction following training data at longer context length.
Interesting.
But yeah, in conclusion then is the whole debate, longer context, is RAG going to be completely irrelevant? Probably not from what we've seen in, these experiments, or in any case, it just needs a bit more investigation. And I like that they highlighted that in any case, it highlights the need for, app developers to use a good evaluation tool, for example, agent evaluation, to evaluate the systems. It can quickly get a bit complex.